A new beginning. The air was crisp with the scent of fall as Malik and Serena Daniels walked hand in hand into the brick-lined entrance of Meadowbrook Academy. The prestigious private school was a beacon of academic excellence nestled in the heart of their community. For the Daniels family, this was a monumental step forward. A chance for their 10-year-old daughter, Alina, to thrive in an environment designed to nurture young minds. Meadowbrook had been a dream for years, something Malik and Serena had saved for tirelessly. The school's diverse student body, modern facilities, and experienced faculty promised a fresh start for their daughter, who had endured a troubling year at her previous school. There, Alina had been targeted by bullies, and the emotional toll had left scars that her parents were determined to help her heal. "This is it," Malik said, his voice filled with cautious optimism. "Alina's going to shine here." Serena nodded, her chestnut curls bouncing slightly as they walked through the polished hallways. Children's artwork adorned the walls, showcasing an array of vibrant colors and creativity. It was a picture-perfect environment. Malik noticed Serena's eyes lingering on a mural painted by the students, hands of every skin tone encircling a globe with the words "United through Diversity" emblazoned above it. "It feels right," she said softly, her voice laced with hope. "This is the place where she'll flourish." When they reached Alina's classroom, they were greeted warmly by Mrs. Reynolds, her current teacher. The older woman, with streaks of gray threading through her neatly tied bun, was known for her nurturing demeanor. She beamed as she welcomed the couple, extending a hand to Malik and Serena. "Mr. and Mrs. Daniels, I'm so glad to finally meet you in person. Alina is such a joy to have in class. Her curiosity and kindness are contagious," Mrs. Reynolds said, her tone genuine. Hearing this, Malik and Serena exchanged proud glances. Alina's intelligence and compassion were qualities they had worked hard to cultivate despite the challenges she'd faced. "She's a special girl," Malik said, his deep voice filled with pride. "We just want to make sure she feels safe and supported here." "She does," Mrs. Reynolds assured them. "This is a community where every child matters. And speaking of community, I'd like to introduce you to Mrs. Harper, who will be taking over as Alina's teacher starting Monday." A tall woman with sharp features and a polished appearance stepped into the room, her presence commanding attention. Mrs. Harper extended a manicured hand, her smile wide, but not entirely warm. "It's a pleasure to meet you both," she said, her voice smooth and measured. "I've heard wonderful things about Alina. I'm looking forward to helping her reach her full potential." While Serena offered a polite smile, Malik felt an inexplicable unease. Mrs. Harper's words were pleasant enough, but something in her tone felt calculated, as if she were reading from a script. He dismissed the thought, reminding himself not to overthink. As they left the school that evening, Alina was eager to hear about the meeting. She sat cross-legged on the living room carpet, her almond eyes sparkling with excitement. "What did Mrs. Reynolds say about me?" she asked, clutching her favorite stuffed rabbit, a comfort item from her childhood. Malik crouched beside her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "She said you're one of the kindest and smartest students she's ever taught," he replied, his voice brimming with pride. "And your new teacher, Mrs. Harper, seems excited to have you in her class." Alina grinned, her cheeks dimpling. "I can't wait to meet her. Jenny says her class does really cool science experiments." That night, as they tucked Alina into bed, Malik and Serena exchanged hopeful whispers. Their little girl was happy and confident, ready to embark on a new chapter. But as they turned off the lights, Malik couldn't shake the faint twinge of doubt he'd felt earlier. He told himself it was nothing, just the remnants of worry left over from the past. The following week began uneventfully. Alina woke up early, buzzing with excitement for her first day in Mrs. Harper's class. Her plaid school uniform was ironed to perfection, and her curls were neatly tied with a purple ribbon. Malik and Serena watched her board the school bus, waving enthusiastically as it pulled away. "She's going to be amazing," Serena said, squeezing Malik's hand. But by the time Alina returned home that afternoon, the light in her eyes had dimmed. When asked about her day, her responses were short and guarded. "It was okay," she said, barely touching her dinner. Her usual appetite for Serena's homemade lasagna was nowhere to be seen. "Just first-day jitters," Serena reasoned later that evening. "She'll settle in." But the pattern repeated itself over the next few days. Alina became increasingly withdrawn, eating less and spending more time in her room. Malik noticed her once vibrant demeanor fading, replaced by a quiet unease that gnawed at his instincts. One evening, as he tucked her into bed, Malik sat on the edge of her mattress. "Princess," he began gently, "is everything okay at school? You know you can tell me anything, right?" Alina hesitated, her eyes darting away. "It's fine, Daddy. I'm just tired." But Malik knew his daughter better than that. The way her voice quivered and her hands fidgeted with the hem of her blanket told him there was more she wasn't saying. "I'm here for you," he said softly, kissing her forehead. "Always." That night, Malik lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Something was wrong. He was certain of it. And he was determined to find out what. Unease beneath the surface. The first beams of morning sunlight filtered through the kitchen windows as Malik sipped his coffee in silence. Across the table, Serena was meticulously packing Alina's lunch, her brow furrowed in thought. The tension in the Daniels household had been palpable all week, though no one had openly acknowledged it. Alina's sudden change in behavior hung over them like a cloud, and Malik couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. "You noticed it too, haven't you?" Serena finally broke the silence, her voice low. Malik set his coffee cup down and nodded. "She's not herself. She's withdrawn, barely eating, and when she does talk, it's like she's forcing herself." Serena sighed, closing the lunchbox and setting it aside. "What do we do? Do we wait for her to tell us what's going on, or do we step in?" "I don't think we can wait," Malik replied firmly. "You remember how long it took her to tell us about the bullying at her old school? By the time she opened up, she was already carrying so much pain." Serena nodded solemnly. They had promised themselves never to let something like that happen again. But this time felt different, less overt, harder to pinpoint. Whatever was happening, Malik was determined to get to the bottom of it. Later that morning, Malik decided to take an unplanned day off from work. He kissed Serena goodbye, reassured her with a quick explanation about running errands, and left the house just as Alina boarded the school bus. But instead of heading to the office, he drove straight to Meadowbrook Academy. He parked his car a block away and positioned himself where he could observe the school discreetly. The morning was uneventful at first. Through the large cafeteria windows, Malik could see the usual bustle of children arriving, chatting, and settling into their routines. Alina's class appeared at recess, and he watched her closely. She stood near the edge of the playground, her arms folded as she watched the other children play. Occasionally, a classmate would approach her, but the interactions were brief, and Alina would quickly retreat into herself. Malik's chest tightened. This wasn't like his daughter. Alina had always been outgoing, the kind of child who brought people together. To see her so withdrawn felt like watching the color drain from a once vivid painting. When lunchtime arrived, Malik's unease deepened. He saw Alina enter the cafeteria with her class, clutching her lunchbox. She sat at a table near the back, away from the noise and laughter of the other students. Malik noticed her fidgeting, her gaze fixed on the unopened lunchbox as if dreading its contents. As he continued to watch, he noticed Mrs. Harper enter the cafeteria. The teacher's presence immediately caught his attention. She moved with an air of authority, her sharp gaze sweeping across the room. Malik's instincts sharpened as he observed her walk directly to Alina's table. From his vantage point, he couldn't hear what was being said, but he could see the exchange. Mrs. Harper leaned down, speaking to Alina in a way that made his daughter visibly shrink. Whatever was being said, it was clear that it wasn't friendly. Malik's fists clenched as he watched Mrs. Harper snatch the lunchbox from Alina's hands, open it, and inspect its contents. She said something else, her lips curling into what looked like a sneer, then tossed the lunchbox back onto the table with enough force to make Alina flinch. Malik had seen enough. He grabbed his phone and made his way toward the school entrance. Inside the school, Malik asked to speak with the principal, Mr. Whittaker. The receptionist, sensing his urgency, quickly led him to the principal's office. Mr. Whittaker, a middle-aged man with a balding head and kind eyes, greeted Malik with a firm handshake. "Mr. Daniels, what brings you in today?" he asked, gesturing for Malik to sit. Malik didn't mince words. "It's about my daughter, Alina. Something's not right, and I think it has to do with Mrs. Harper." Mr. Whittaker's brows knit together. "Mrs. Harper? She's one of our most experienced teachers. What exactly seems to be the issue?" Malik relayed what he had seen that morning, his voice steady but laced with anger. He described Alina's change in behavior, her withdrawal, and the incident in the cafeteria. The principal listened intently, occasionally jotting down notes. "I understand your concerns," Mr. Whittaker said when Malik had finished. "I'll need to speak with Mrs. Harper and investigate the matter thoroughly. Meadowbrook prides itself on fostering a safe and inclusive environment, and if there's any truth to these claims, we will address it immediately." "Investigate all you want," Malik said, standing. "But I'm not leaving this alone. If my daughter is being mistreated, I'll do whatever it takes to protect her." That afternoon, Malik picked Alina up from school instead of letting her ride the bus. When she saw him waiting by the gate, her face lit up briefly, but the moment passed quickly, replaced by the same guarded expression she'd worn all week. "How was school today?" Malik asked as they walked to the car. "It was fine," Alina replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Malik stopped and crouched to her level, placing his hands gently on her shoulders. "Alina, I need you to be honest with me. Did something happen today with Mrs. Harper?" Her eyes darted away, and she bit her lip. "No," she said quickly, but the slight quiver in her voice gave her away. "Alina, look at me," Malik said softly. When her eyes finally met his, he saw the tears brimming there. "You can tell me anything. Whatever it is, we'll handle it together." Alina hesitated, then broke down, tears streaming down her face. "She hates me, Daddy," she sobbed. "She says I don't belong here. She checks my lunch every day and throws it away if it's not something she likes. Today she said my food smelled bad." Malik felt a surge of anger so intense it took every ounce of self-control to stay calm. He pulled his daughter into a tight hug, his heart breaking at her words. "I'm so sorry this is happening to you, Princess," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I promise you, it's going to stop. No one gets to treat you like this." That night, Malik and Serena sat at the kitchen table, their earlier optimism replaced by a grim determination. Malik shared everything Alina had told him, and together, they crafted a plan. Malik would return to the school the next day to confront Mrs. Harper directly, while Serena reached out to other parents to gather information about whether their children had witnessed anything unusual. As the night wore on, one thing became clear: they would not let Alina face this alone. Whatever it took, they would fight for their daughter's safety and dignity. The tipping point. The next morning, Malik rose early, his resolve solidified after a sleepless night. Serena had stayed up as well, strategizing and reaching out to parents in their network. They had pieced together bits of troubling information. Rumors of Mrs. Harper's strictness, complaints from other children about her condescending demeanor, and one cryptic comment from a parent who simply said, "She's not what she seems." As Alina ate breakfast quietly at the kitchen table, Malik sat across from her. He placed a hand on her small shoulder, looking into her eyes. "Today, I'm going to stay close, okay? I'm not going to let anything happen to you." Alina nodded, her expression a mix of gratitude and apprehension. "Are you going to talk to Mrs. Harper?" she asked softly. "Yes," Malik said firmly. "And to Principal Whittaker. This ends now." When Malik dropped Alina off at school, he parked nearby and waited, watching the school entrance from his car. He had already emailed his office to take another personal day, knowing he wouldn't be able to focus on work until this situation was resolved. The minutes ticked by as he observed children filing into the building. His heart ached as he saw Alina enter, her usual confidence diminished, her steps hesitant. Once the hallways were quiet, Malik exited his car and walked into the school. He had no plan to wait for things to escalate further. Inside the principal's office, Malik was met by Mr. Whittaker, who seemed surprised but not unwelcoming. The man gestured for him to sit down. "Mr. Daniels," the principal began, "I've been looking into the concerns you raised yesterday. I spoke briefly with Mrs. Harper, and she assured me there's been a misunderstanding." Malik's jaw tightened. "A misunderstanding?" he repeated, incredulous. "Mr. Whittaker, my daughter is coming home terrified, refusing to eat lunch, and crying herself to sleep. Whatever Mrs. Harper told you is a lie." The principal sighed. "I'm not dismissing your concerns, Mr. Daniels. I simply want to ensure we approach this situation fairly. If there's something more going on, we'll address it." "That's not good enough," Malik said, leaning forward. "I've been patient, but my daughter is suffering. I need answers now." Just then, the door opened, and Mrs. Harper walked in. Her expression was neutral, her posture rigid. "Good morning," she said coolly, glancing between the two men. "I understand there's been some concern about my classroom practices." Malik stood, his fists clenching at his sides. "Concern? My daughter says you've been targeting her, humiliating her, taking her food and throwing it away. Is that what you call classroom practices?" Mrs. Harper's lips tightened. "Mr. Daniels, I assure you I treat all my students equally. If Alina feels otherwise, it's unfortunate, but I'm afraid this is a misunderstanding. I've never taken food from a child or made any inappropriate remarks." Malik's frustration boiled over. "So you're calling my daughter a liar?" "I'm saying," Mrs. Harper replied evenly, "that children sometimes misinterpret situations. I encourage a strict environment, yes, but it's always in the interest of their education." "Strict isn't the word for it," Malik shot back. "Cruel is. Alina told me you insulted her lunch and called it smelly. You've been singling her out since the first day. Explain that." Mrs. Harper's expression faltered for the briefest moment, but she quickly recovered. "I'm sorry Alina feels that way, but I assure you, I've done nothing wrong." Principal Whittaker interjected. "Mrs. Harper, I think it's best if we address these concerns transparently. Mr. Daniels, do you have any evidence of what you're alleging?" Malik hesitated. He had Alina's testimony and his observations from the previous day, but nothing concrete. He didn't have video footage or other witnesses, yet. "I don't have proof," Malik admitted, his voice firm. "But I know what's happening, and I'm not letting this go." Whittaker nodded. "We'll continue our investigation, Mr. Daniels. In the meantime, I'll personally oversee Alina's lunchtime today to ensure there are no further issues." Malik's anger simmered, but he recognized a small victory. For now, someone would be watching. He left the office with a promise to his daughter and himself that this wasn't the end. Malik stayed in the parking lot for most of the day, observing again. He saw Alina during recess, her body language still guarded. At lunchtime, he watched her enter the cafeteria and noticed Principal Whittaker standing near the serving line, as promised. But something gnawed at Malik. He knew from experience that people like Mrs. Harper didn't stop when they thought no one was watching. They became more discreet. After school, Malik picked Alina up again, noting the slight improvement in her demeanor. She smiled faintly when she saw him, but her usual enthusiasm was still absent. "Did anything happen today?" he asked as they drove home. "Not really," Alina said. "Mr. Whittaker was in the cafeteria. Mrs. Harper didn't say anything mean, but she kept looking at me." Malik's grip on the steering wheel tightened. Even without words, Mrs. Harper's actions were sending a message, and Alina was still feeling its weight. That evening, Serena shared a breakthrough. One of the parents she had contacted had a daughter in Mrs. Harper's class last year. The parent, named Camille, had expressed concerns about Mrs. Harper's behavior toward her child, a biracial girl named Zoe. Camille described similar patterns, subtle but persistent targeting, dismissive comments, and isolating tactics. "She's done this before," Serena said, her voice trembling with anger. "It's not just Alina." Malik felt a surge of determination. This wasn't just about his daughter anymore. It was about holding Mrs. Harper accountable for a pattern of harm. That night, Malik made calls to other parents, documenting every story, every detail. By the time he was done, he had enough to demand a formal meeting with the school board. He wasn't going to rest until justice was served. As he prepared to head to bed, Malik stood in the doorway of Alina's room, watching her sleep. Her stuffed rabbit was tucked under her arm, her face peaceful for the first time in days. "I've got you, princess," he whispered. "I'll never let anyone hurt you again." Unearthing the truth. The morning after Serena's breakthrough, Malik woke up with a sense of renewed purpose. The stories from other parents had confirmed his suspicions. Mrs. Harper had a history of targeting vulnerable students, and Alina wasn't her first victim. Malik and Serena had spent the night compiling these accounts into a detailed document. It was time to escalate matters. A community awakens. Malik decided to start the day by visiting Camille, the parent Serena had spoken with the night before. Camille lived a few blocks away, and when Malik arrived, she greeted him at the door with a look of cautious optimism. "Thank you for coming," Malik said, as he stepped inside the modest yet inviting home. Camille's daughter Zoe sat at the kitchen table, coloring quietly. The little girl's curly hair framed her face, and her bright eyes flicked up nervously when Malik entered. "Zoe, why don't you go play in your room for a little while?" Camille suggested gently. Zoe nodded, grabbing her art supplies before heading down the hall. Once she was out of earshot, Camille turned back to Malik. "She still talks about Mrs. Harper sometimes," Camille said, her voice low. "It's been a year, but the things that woman said to her, they don't just disappear." Malik listened intently as Camille recounted Zoe's experience. Mrs. Harper had often dismissed Zoe's answers in class, belittling her in front of her peers. During group projects, she would exclude Zoe from leadership roles, claiming she wasn't ready for the responsibility. And then there were the comments, veiled insults about Zoe's appearance and background that chipped away at her confidence. When I confronted the school, they assured me it was a misunderstanding, Camille said bitterly. "I was told Mrs. Harper was a respected educator, and that I was overreacting. But now I know I wasn't alone." "You weren't," Malik said firmly, "and we're not going to let this go. Together, we have a chance to stop her." Camille nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "Whatever you need, I'm in." Building the case. Over the next few days, Malik and Serena worked tirelessly, gathering more stories from parents and students who had experienced Mrs. Harper's behavior. They uncovered a troubling pattern. Mrs. Harper seemed to target children of color, singling them out with subtle but harmful tactics. Her victims were often left feeling isolated and inadequate, yet her actions were just restrained enough to avoid drawing widespread attention. Serena created a spreadsheet to organize the accounts, detailing dates, incidents, and witnesses. Malik contacted the school board, requesting a formal meeting to address the issue. He also reached out to a local education advocate, Marissa Cooper, who had experience dealing with discriminatory practices in schools. "This isn't just about Mrs. Harper," Marissa said during their first phone call. "This is about systemic issues. If the administration has been ignoring this behavior, they're complicit. We need to hold them accountable too." Malik agreed, his determination growing stronger. He felt a deep responsibility, not just to Alina, but to every child who had been affected by Mrs. Harper's actions. The confrontation. By the time Malik returned to Meadowbrook Academy. He was armed with evidence and support. He had scheduled a meeting with Principal Whitaker, Mrs. Harper, and 2 representatives from the school board. Marissa Cooper accompanied him, her presence a powerful statement that this was not a battle Malik intended to fight alone. The meeting took place in a conference room adjacent to the principal's office. Mrs. Harper sat at one end of the long table, her posture rigid and her expression unreadable. Principal Whitaker sat beside her, looking visibly uncomfortable. Across from them sat Malik, Serena, Marissa, and one of the school board members, a middle-aged woman with a stern but fair demeanor. "Thank you all for coming," Mr. Whitaker began, his voice strained. "We're here to address the concerns raised by Mr. and Mrs. Daniels regarding Mrs. Harper's conduct." Malik wasted no time. He placed a thick folder on the table and slid it toward the school board member. This contains statements from multiple parents and students about Mrs. Harper's behavior. These aren't isolated incidents. This is a pattern. The board member opened the folder, her eyes scanning the pages. Mrs. Harper shifted uncomfortably in her seat, but she remained silent. "Mrs. Harper," Marissa said, her tone calm but firm, "these accounts describe a troubling pattern of targeting and mistreatment of students, particularly those from marginalized backgrounds. How do you respond to these allegations?" Mrs. Harper folded her hands in her lap, her lips pursed. "I have always maintained high standards for my students," she said finally. "If some parents feel that my methods are too strict, that's unfortunate, but my intentions have always been to prepare these children for the real world." "And how does insulting a child's lunch prepare them for the real world?" Malik demanded, his voice rising. "Or singling them out in front of their peers, or making them feel like they don't belong." Mrs. Harper's composure cracked slightly, but she quickly recovered. "I don't recall any such incidents," she said dismissively. "Children can be very imaginative." "That's enough," the board member interjected, her tone sharp. She turned to Principal Whitaker. "Mr. Whitaker, are you aware of these allegations?" Whitaker hesitated, beads of sweat forming on his brow. "I was made aware of Mr. Daniels' concerns recently, but—" "You mean to tell us you didn't know Mrs. Harper had a history of these complaints?" Marissa interrupted. "Either you're complicit or you're incompetent." Whitaker opened his mouth to respond, but the board member raised a hand. "We'll address the administration's role separately. Right now, our focus is on Mrs. Harper." The breaking point. The tension in the room was palpable as the board member continued to review the evidence. Finally, she turned to Mrs. Harper. "Given the volume and consistency of these accounts, I believe a thorough investigation is warranted. Until that investigation is complete, you are suspended from your duties, effective immediately." Mrs. Harper's face turned pale. "You can't be serious. These are baseless accusations." "They are anything but baseless," the board member replied sternly. "And if even half of this is true, you have no place in this school, or any school." As Mrs. Harper was escorted from the room, Malik felt a weight lift from his shoulders. It wasn't over, not yet, but it was a start. A new chapter. In the weeks that followed, the investigation confirmed the allegations against Mrs. Harper. She was terminated from her position, and the school implemented new policies to address bias and ensure accountability. Malik and Serena continued to advocate for systemic change, becoming voices for other parents in their community. As for Alina, she began to reclaim her confidence, her smile returning little by little. Malik and Serena knew the scars would take time to heal, but they also knew their daughter was strong, and she would thrive. One evening, as Malik tucked Alina into bed, she looked up at him with shining eyes. "Thank you, Daddy," she said softly, "for believing me." Malik kissed her forehead, his heart swelling with pride and love. "Always, Princess, always." Ripple effects. The fallout from Mrs. Harper's suspension sent shockwaves through Meadowbrook Academy. For a school that prided itself on diversity and inclusion, the exposure of such blatant misconduct struck a nerve. Parents, faculty, and even students began to reevaluate their assumptions about the school's environment. Malik and Serena found themselves at the center of a movement they hadn't anticipated, but were more than willing to lead. A growing movement. The day after Mrs. Harper's suspension was announced, Malik received a call from a local news outlet. Word had spread quickly, thanks to social media and the community's growing frustration with the school's initial inaction. The reporter, a sharp and empathetic woman named Lee Ortiz, wanted to interview Malik and Serena about their experience. "This isn't just about Mrs. Harper," Malik told Leah during the interview. They sat in the Daniels' living room, the morning sunlight streaming through the windows. Serena sat beside him, her hand resting on his knee. "It's about every child who has ever felt like they didn't belong because of the color of their skin, their background, or their family. Schools are supposed to be safe spaces, but that's not always the reality." Serena nodded, her voice steady but passionate. "We've heard from so many parents who've experienced similar situations at this school and others. It's clear that this isn't an isolated issue. We need systemic change, not just promises." The interview aired that evening, and the response was overwhelming. Parents from across the city reached out, sharing their own stories of bias and discrimination in schools. Some had children who had suffered in silence for years, while others were educators themselves, frustrated by the lack of accountability within the system. An opportunity to lead. The momentum sparked by the Daniels story led to a community meeting at Meadowbrook Academy. Malik and Serena were invited to speak, along with Marissa Cooper and other advocates. The school board, Principal Whiteacre, and several teachers also attended, their expressions ranging from defensive to genuinely contrite. The auditorium was packed. Rows of parents sat shoulder to shoulder, their faces a mix of anger, hope, and determination. Malik stood at the podium, his heart pounding as he faced the crowd. He glanced at Serena, who gave him an encouraging nod. "I'm here today not just as a father, but as a member of this community," Malik began. "What happened to my daughter, Alina, was unacceptable. But what makes it worse is knowing that she's not alone. That so many other children have been hurt in similar ways." He paused, scanning the room. "We need to hold people accountable. Teachers, administrators, even ourselves as parents. But we also need to create systems that prevent this kind of harm from happening in the first place." Marissa followed, outlining concrete steps the school could take. Mandatory bias training for teachers, anonymous reporting systems for students, and a more transparent process for addressing complaints. When it was Serena's turn to speak, her voice carried a quiet strength. "We're not here to tear this school down," she said. "We're here to make it better. For our children, for their futures, and for every family that calls this community home." A reckoning for the school. The pressure on Meadowbrook's administration grew in the weeks following the meeting. Principal Whitaker faced scrutiny for his handling of previous complaints against Mrs. Harper, and the school board initiated a formal review of his leadership. Though he expressed regret during public statements, many parents felt his actions, or lack thereof, had contributed to the problem. Meanwhile, Mrs. Harper's dismissal became official after the investigation concluded. The evidence was damning, and her refusal to cooperate only solidified the decision. While some of her supporters claimed she had been unfairly targeted, the overwhelming majority of the community stood with the Daniels family. The school board announced sweeping changes, including a new code of conduct for teachers and administrators. They also hired Marissa Cooper as a consultant to oversee the implementation of these reforms. Healing and rebuilding. For Alina, life slowly began to return to normal. Her new teacher, Miss Patel, was a stark contrast to Mrs. Harper, kind, patient, and genuinely invested in her students' well-being. Under Ms. Patel's guidance, Alina began to rebuild her confidence. She joined the science club, started participating in group projects again, and even made a new friend, a bubbly girl named Tessa who shared her love of reading. One evening, as Malik helped Alina with her homework, she paused and looked up at him. "Daddy, do you think Mrs. Harper was like that because she didn't like me?" Malik set down the pencil he was holding and met her gaze. "No, Princess. What Mrs. Harper did says everything about her and nothing about you. You're amazing, just the way you are. Never let anyone make you think otherwise." Alina smiled, her eyes shining with trust and gratitude. "I won't." Looking ahead. As the Daniels family moved forward, they remained committed to advocating for change. Malik joined the school's parent advisory committee, while Serena worked with Marissa to develop a guide for other parents on how to recognize and address discrimination in schools. One Saturday morning, as the family walked through the neighborhood park, Malik felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt in months. Alina ran ahead, laughing as Tessa tried to catch her in a game of tag. Serena slipped her hand into Malik's, her smile warm. "We did it," she said softly. "We protected her." Malik nodded, his gaze fixed on their daughter's joyful face. "And we'll keep doing it," he replied. "For her. For all of them." Ripple effects. A legal turning point. While the community rallied behind the Daniels family, legal developments added another layer of complexity. Malik and Serena had contacted a civil rights attorney, Angela Miles, who specialized in education law. Angela had reviewed their documentation and determined there was a strong case for pursuing legal action against both Mrs. Harper and the school. "This isn't just about punitive damages," Angela explained during a meeting at her office. "It's about setting a precedent. Schools need to understand that ignoring discrimination has consequences." Malik and Serena agreed. While they had no desire to drag Alina through a prolonged legal battle, they knew the case could spark real change. Over the following weeks, Angela filed a lawsuit on behalf of Alina, citing emotional distress and the school's negligence in addressing prior complaints against Mrs. Harper. The lawsuit garnered significant media attention, amplifying the Daniels family's fight for justice. Local and national outlets covered the story, framing it as a larger issue of systemic bias in schools. For Malik, the legal proceedings were exhausting but necessary. He fielded calls from reporters, attended strategy sessions with Angela, and coordinated with other families willing to testify. Throughout it all, he was careful to shield Alina from the public scrutiny, ensuring her routine stayed as normal as possible. A wave of support. The Daniels family story resonated far beyond their community. Advocacy groups, educators, and parents across the country reached out to offer their support. Some sent letters, others shared similar experiences, and a few even offered to donate to the family's legal fund. One letter stood out to Malik. It came from a retired teacher, Mr. Avery, who had worked at Meadowbrook Academy years ago. His words painted a damning picture of the school's culture during his tenure. "I saw signs of this behavior in Mrs. Harper years ago," Mr. Avery wrote. "She was subtle, but her bias was there. I regret not speaking up sooner. I hope this case brings the accountability that's long overdue." The letter strengthened Malik's resolve. It wasn't just about protecting Alina. It was about confronting a culture that had allowed someone like Mrs. Harper to thrive. Turning the tables. As the community's pressure on the school intensified, Principal Whittaker's position became increasingly tenuous. The school board launched an internal investigation, uncovering a pattern of dismissing or minimizing complaints about bias. While Whittaker had initially been viewed as a passive figure in the controversy, it became clear that his inaction had enabled harmful behavior to persist. During a heated school board meeting, Whittaker attempted to defend his record. "We've always strived to create an inclusive environment," he said, his voice wavering. "Mistakes were made, but my intentions were always to support the students." His words fell flat. One by one, parents stood up to share their stories, many of which highlighted the administration's failure to act on their concerns. Malik was the last to speak, his voice steady but charged with emotion. "Intentions don't protect our children," he said. "Actions do. And this administration's actions, or lack thereof, put my daughter and countless others in harm's way. That's not leadership. That's negligence." By the end of the meeting, it was clear that Whittaker's time as principal was coming to an end. Within a month, he announced his resignation, citing a need to focus on personal growth. While the announcement felt like a victory, Malik and Serena knew the fight wasn't over. Changing leadership was only one step toward lasting reform. Healing through advocacy. As the lawsuit progressed, Malik and Serena found themselves drawn deeper into advocacy work. They began collaborating with Marissa Cooper to organize workshops for parents and educators, focusing on recognizing and addressing bias in schools. The workshops quickly gained traction, attracting attendees from across the city. One evening, after a particularly successful session, Marissa approached Malik. "You know," she said, "you and Serena have a gift for this. Have you thought about making it more permanent? Starting an organization, maybe?" Malik considered her words. Advocacy had given him a sense of purpose beyond his own family struggle. He looked at Serena, who was chatting animatedly with a group of parents, and saw the same determination in her eyes. "We'll think about it," he replied. "But for now, we've got a lot of work left to do." A community transformed. By the end of the school year, Meadowbrook Academy was a different place. The school board had implemented a series of reforms, including mandatory training on implicit bias, a new process for handling complaints, and the establishment of a diversity and equity committee. Malik was invited to join the committee, ensuring that parents had a voice in shaping the school's future. Alina, too, was thriving. Under the guidance of Ms. Patel, she rediscovered her love for learning. She entered a citywide science fair and won second place with a project on renewable energy. When she stood on the stage to accept her award, her smile was radiant, a reminder of her resilience and strength. Looking forward. On the last day of school, as the Daniels family walked through Meadowbrook's hallways, Malik felt a sense of closure. The school wasn't perfect, and the scars of the past year wouldn't fade overnight. But there was progress, and that was worth celebrating. As they stepped outside, Serena squeezed Malik's hand. "We did it," she said softly. "No," Malik replied, watching Alina laugh with her friends. "She did it. She's the reason we fought so hard." Serena smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. "And she's the reason we'll keep fighting." As they walked to their car, the future felt brighter than it had in a long time. Together, they had turned pain into purpose and created a legacy of hope for the next generation. A legacy of change. Months after the Daniels family's battle with Meadowbrook Academy, life began to settle into a new normal. The scars of the past year were still present but served as a reminder of their strength and resilience. Malik and Serena knew their fight had only just begun. What had started as a personal battle for their daughter had blossomed into a larger mission for justice, accountability, and reform. A movement is born. The workshops Malik and Serena had been hosting with Marissa Cooper evolved into something much bigger. Parents, educators, and community leaders began to rally around their vision of creating safer, more inclusive schools. Inspired by their story, a group of local activists offered to help them establish a nonprofit organization, Voices for Change in Education, VCE. At first, Malik was hesitant. Running a nonprofit seemed like an enormous undertaking, especially with their already busy lives. But Serena was resolute. "We've already proven we can make a difference," she said one evening as they reviewed the paperwork for the organization. "This isn't just about Alina anymore. It's about every child who has ever felt invisible, unsafe, or unsupported. We have a chance to build something that lasts." Malik couldn't argue with that. Together, they launched VCE with a mission to empower families, advocate for systemic reform, and provide resources for schools to create equitable environments. Their first major event was a community forum, held in the auditorium of a nearby high school. Over 200 people attended, including educators, school administrators, and parents eager to share their experiences. Malik and Serena stood side by side on stage, addressing the crowd with equal parts passion and determination. "This isn't about assigning blame," Malik said, his voice steady. "It's about taking responsibility for our schools, our children, and our communities. Every child deserves a chance to thrive, and that starts with us." The crowd erupted into applause, and for the first time, Malik felt the true scope of what they had started. The ripple effect. As VCE gained traction, it began to attract attention from outside the community. Other districts invited Malik and Serena to speak about their experiences, while national organizations reached out to collaborate. Serena, who had a knack for storytelling, spearheaded a podcast series where parents and students could share their stories. The podcast, titled Unheard Voices, quickly gained a following, sparking conversations about bias and equity in schools across the country. Meanwhile, Alina adjusted to her new normal. Her confidence had returned, and she was thriving in Ms. Patel's class. She often accompanied her parents to VC events, where she met other children who had faced similar challenges. The experience was empowering, teaching her that her voice mattered. One day, as Malik prepared for a workshop, Alina approached him with a notebook in hand. "Daddy," she said shyly, "can I share my story at the next event?" Malik's heart swelled with pride. "Of course, Princess," he said, kneeling to her level. "Your story is the most important one of all." A return to Meadowbrook. As part of VC's work, Malik and Serena continued to collaborate with Meadowbrook Academy. Under the leadership of a new principal, Dr. Elena Morales, the school had made significant strides. Policies have been updated, teachers underwent regular bias training, and the Diversity and Equity Committee, of which Malik was now a key member, met monthly to discuss ongoing improvements. Dr. Morales invited Malik and Serena to speak at a staff development day. Standing before the school's teachers and administrators, Malik reflected on how far they had come. "When we first walked into this school, we believed it was a safe haven for our daughter," he said. "But safety isn't just about policies. It's about people. Every interaction you have with a student has the power to lift them up or tear them down. Don't underestimate the impact you can have." Serena followed, her voice filled with emotion. "This school has the potential to be a model for others, but it requires all of us to stay vigilant. Change isn't a one-time event. It's a continuous effort." By the end of their talk, the room was filled with applause, and several teachers approached them afterward to express their gratitude. Malik and Serena left feeling hopeful, knowing that the seeds of change were taking root. A new challenge. With their advocacy work growing, Malik and Serena faced a new challenge, balancing their personal lives with their mission. Late nights preparing for events and long days managing VCE left them little time for themselves. Serena, ever the planner, insisted on carving out family time. One Saturday, they decided to take a break from their busy schedules and spend the day at the park. As they picnicked under the shade of a sprawling oak tree, Alina presented them with a drawing she had made. It depicted a classroom filled with smiling children of all different backgrounds, with a banner overhead that read, "Everyone belongs." Malik and Serena exchanged a look, their hearts full. "You know, Princess," Serena said, pulling Alina close, "that's exactly what we're working for." The lawsuit concludes. Months after filing the lawsuit against Meadowbrook Academy, the case reached a resolution. The school agreed to a settlement that included financial restitution for Alina's emotional distress, as well as a commitment to implementing the reforms VCE had proposed. The Daniels family donated a portion of the settlement to VCE, ensuring the fight for equity could continue. During the final hearing, Malik delivered a powerful statement. "This settlement isn't just for my daughter," he said. "It's for every child who deserves to feel safe and valued. And it's a reminder that when we stand together, we can create a better future." The courtroom was silent as Malik spoke, the weight of his words sinking in. When he finished, Serena squeezed his hand, her eyes glistening with pride. A brighter future. As the Daniels family moved forward, they found joy in the small victories. Alina's laughter, the thank you notes from parents they had helped, the progress reports from Meadowbrook. Their journey had been grueling, but it had also been transformative. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Malik and Serena sat on their porch, watching Alina play with her friends in the yard. "You know," Malik said, wrapping his arm around Serena, "I never thought we'd end up here, but I wouldn't change a thing." Serena smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. "Neither would I. We turned something painful into something powerful." In the distance, Alina's laughter rang out, a reminder that no matter how hard the fight, it was always worth it. Epilogue. The road ahead. Years later, VCE had grown into a national organization, with chapters in multiple states and a reputation for driving meaningful change. Malik and Serena had become prominent voices in the fight for educational equity, their story a beacon of hope for families everywhere. And Alina. She grew up to be a leader in her own right, using her voice to advocate for others. When she stood on a stage at her college graduation, delivering a speech about resilience and community, Malik and Serena sat in the front row, tears streaming down their faces. Their journey had started with pain, but it had ended with purpose, a legacy of change that would echo for generations to come.